Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Chennai International Centre's webinar today. We will begin the session now with a welcome note by CIC trustee, Mr. Venugopal Kasturi of the Hindu Board. Let me hand it over to you, Venu, to start the session.
Good evening. On behalf of the patrons and directors of the Chennai International Centre, I have great pleasure in welcoming all of you to yet another virtual meeting. In the past weeks of the lockdown, our members know we have broken new ground. We have moved away from our usual auditorium at the Madras School of Economics, where we used to have 2 meetings a month. Now pushed into the digital avatar, we are now able to do up to 4 meetings a month. You must say we have been more productive. We've been able to bring you speakers not just from Chennai, but from other cities in the country and from overseas, and all at the same time. That's the technology we have embraced, the new capability we have harnessed. Moreover, we now have more of you people in the virtual meeting room than we could ever assemble in our auditorium at the Madras School of Economics. Of course, you may be still missing the networking, the filter coffee, the kira vadai, the gajar halwa, but I trust we are furnishing enough food for thought. Today we have as speaker one of the brightest leaders of the BJP, Mr. Jayant Sinha, a member of parliament from Hazaribagh and chairman of the Committee on Finance in Parliament. Mr. Sinha holds an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School, an MS in Energy Management and Policy from the University of Pennsylvania, and a Bachelor of Technology degree with distinction from IIT Delhi. And Mr. Sinha's prior business experience includes 12 years with McKinsey & Company as partner in the Boston and Delhi office. Mr. Sinha, thank you for taking the time to be on this program. Our topic today is rebuilding the economy. As you all know, the coronavirus has delivered a sucker punch, and truly the economy is on the floor. When you're down on the mat, the only direction you can move, I guess, is up. But how soon are we going to be up and running? And governments in the developed world have been pumping large stimulus packages into their economies to speed up the recovery. Our government has opened its purse, but only a wee bit in many eyes. How big and how generous a hand will the government offer to pull up the economy? Steering him through the discussion this evening will be the seasoned television journalist Chandra Srikanth of ET Now. A warm welcome to you, Chandra. The way this program will run is that Mr. Sinha will speak for about half an hour. Chandra will then lead him to expand on subjects that you, the audience, want him to speak on. And importantly, she will reserve enough time for a few direct questions from you. Over to Mr. Sinha.
Good evening, Venu, and I'm very pleased and glad to be with you all, albeit virtually at the Chennai International Centre. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present to you all and to all the members of the Chennai International Centre. Knowing the distinguished guests you've had, I feel not just in good company, but I must say that I'm probably lowering your very, very high standards. So I apologize for that upfront.
Not at all.
And I will say I'm sorry I couldn't join you all in person in Chennai. I will certainly miss the South Indian filter coffee, but I have had some coffee for today, so hopefully I'm suitably fortified for this interaction. One thing I will say, I generally tend to prefer to take questions and answers because I think that makes it a much more engaging and interactive session as opposed to having me drone on for 30 or 35 minutes. So I'll keep my remarks a little bit briefer than you might have planned, but I'll try and cover the key points, at least to my thinking, in about 20 minutes. and that will then enable us to take more questions, and we can extend that to 30 or 40 minutes as your members might want. So that's, I think, a good format for us to get started with, if that's all right, Venu. And
yeah, sure.
let me start by giving you a sense of what I see when I look at what's been happening with respect to the coronavirus pandemic, and how this might affect India's economy and India's growth, and very importantly, job creation for our young people. So before I get started, I do want to emphasize, and you all know it, but I think it bears repetition, that what we are seeing with the coronavirus pandemic is genuinely a once in a century shock to the global economic system. As many people have outlined, the last time we had a pandemic of this severity and this global reach was in 1918-19 with the Spanish flu. And of course, as you all know well, at that time, there was a huge impact on global GDP. There was a tremendous impact on populations. I believe India's population at that time declined by 6%. And in fact, in the decade of 1911, 1921, population actually declined. And that in India's recorded history has been the only time in which over a 10-year period population declined. So it was a very, very severe disruption to the global economic system that went through the whole world, and no country was unaffected. And that's essentially what is happening right now with the global coronavirus pandemic as well. We have just gone through, friends, in 2008 and 9, the global financial crisis. So we are very familiar with what happens when we have a global crisis of this magnitude. It has a very long-lasting effect. But what we are seeing, as I said, with the coronavirus pandemic is not a shock that is similar to the global financial crisis. It's much more than that. Now, many experts have said if the global financial crisis was restricted to countries of the West and generally the US and Europe, and it affected only the financial sector, this coronavirus pandemic has affected every country, not just the US and Europe. It has affected every country, and it has impacted every sector, not just the financial services sector. So just through that simple comparison, you can see that severe as the global financial crisis was, this crisis is much more impactful and is far more severe than the global financial crisis. And again, as a result of that, we have to think about this with very fresh approaches. We have to approach this given the duration, the severity, and the magnitude of the shock that we're dealing with. Now, to really understand what the parameters of this economic shock are, to really understand how long this might last, we have to go back to medicine, and we have to go back to the life sciences to really begin to think about how this is going to play out as far as the economy is concerned. And here we have to look towards three important medical breakthroughs. The first important medical breakthrough that we need to assess is testing, diagnostic testing. When will we have the technology? When will we have the diagnostic kits that will enable us to figure out whether somebody is coronavirus positive or negative and be able to do it cheaply and quickly? So that's the first medical breakthrough that's important to understand the severity of the economic shock and the duration of the economic shock. The second important medical breakthrough is obviously the cure, because the moment that we can reduce the severity of the coronavirus illness, the moment we can keep people out of hospital and reduce mortality rates, the quicker we will be able to get past the lockdowns, get past the containment, and reduce the economic impact. The second major medical breakthrough we need to understand is when a cure is going to happen. And the third, of course, is the vaccine. So when we have more than 50% of the population around the world with the vaccine and inoculated, then we will rapidly approach herd immunity and we'll start to bring down the shock as well. So these three medical breakthroughs define the parameters, define the way in which we need to think about the severity and the duration of the economic shock. This is very important, and this is why the medical science in many ways is driving what we will see on the economic side. Now, where are we on these medical breakthroughs? First, As far as the testing problem is concerned, that to my mind is largely solved. We have excellent testing equipment now, and there are different approaches to it. Either we can do serological testing, we can do genetic testing through the PCR tests. And of course, there we have been able to, through the Abbott technology on the PCR side, come up with tests that can give an answer in 15, 20 minutes. And similarly, on the serological side, we brought down the price and the time of testing very, very rapidly. And in the next month or so, I think we'll be in a situation where it'll be virtually like getting a pregnancy test. You get a nasal swab or a throat swab, you put it in a reagent, and you can see by just looking at bars whether you are corona positive or not. So once we get to the point where we can test, then we can contain much better, we can isolate much better, and it enables us to reduce our containment efforts and the lockdown efforts. And the good news on the medical side is that we have done extremely well on the diagnostic side. And so we can start to see a way in which we can move towards much more specific and much more focused and targeted containment efforts. So that's on the testing side. Now, as far as the cure is concerned, we are all following very closely what is happening to remdesivir. We are following very closely what is happening to favipiravir. We've looked at what is happening with HCQ. The good news on the cure side is that there are 6 to 8 drugs that are now in clinical trials that are passing the golden standard that science requires, which is a randomized double-blind clinical trial. So we are doing that right now. And what the experts are telling us is that within 6 months, for sure, we are going to have a cure. Now that makes a very big difference to what happens to the economy. If in 6 months we have a cure that keeps you out of hospital, that reduces mortality rates dramatically, we start to get past the worst of this pandemic. And then finally, the vaccine. And again, here, by the time we inoculate, as I said, 50% of the world's population, we are looking at a timeline of about 18 to 24 months. So, friends, as we think about this incredible economic shock that has happened, when we look to the medical science, it tells us what the parameters are, what the timelines are. It tells us that from now on, because the testing is ready, we can start to go to very, very specific containment efforts. It tells us that in 6 months, we'll have a very good handle on the pandemic. And it tells us that in 18 to 24 months, this period, this very, very difficult, very challenging period of our global economic history will be over. So that's the framework we need to think about. Now, what is the damage that the economy has suffered in the last few weeks of the lockdown, which of course started March 24 and is now gradually being lifted. So how much damage has the economy suffered in these last, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks? How much more damage is the economy likely to suffer in terms of economic activities being depressed till we have very precise containment? How much is likely to be impacted by getting to the cure? This is something that many economic analysts, many macroeconomists are studying very, very closely. And there is a range of forecasts that people have made in terms of what this will do to GDP growth rates. So we have GDP growth rates right now that have been announced on the one hand by the IMF and the government of India, which are at the 2% range, 2% GDP growth rate, nominal, I should add, nominal GDP growth rate. 2% is at one end of the range. And then there are various people that are saying that we will see -1%, -2% at the other end of the range. So that's roughly the range in terms of what these lockdown activities are going to do to economic growth rates in FY21. Now, certainly FY22 is also something that people have looked at already. And for example, what the IMF is saying is that because of the base effect, because of the repression of economic activity, because of the lockdown right now, we are likely to see a sharp rebound in fiscal 22. And the sharp rebound, the IMF thinks, is going to be at a 7.4% GDP growth rate. So that's the IMF's forecast. I think most analysts are saying right now that the rebound in fiscal 22 is going to be a sharp rebound. We'll likely see over 7% GDP growth rate coming in fiscal 22. So that's essentially the way people have analyzed the situation right now. And relative to these forecasts, relative to what we think we will see as far as the disease is concerned, and relative to what we are going to see as far as the economic situation is concerned, the government has come forward with a series of very effective and preemptive policy actions. And let me just sketch those out, and let me try and identify in some ways what the principles are that have driven these very effective policy actions. The first important policy principle I think that the government has been following is that we have to immediately address the vulnerable sections of the population. So, of course, the RBI has given a moratorium on interest payments. We have extended out from a compliance point of view many different deadlines so that these compliance requirements do not become a problem, whether it's filing of taxes, paying GST, those compliance requirements have been shifted out. Then, of course, as far as the rural poor are concerned, we have increased NREGA availability. We put more money into NREGA. We have paid out the Kisan Samman Nidhi. And of course, we have doubled the rations that we are providing people through the public distribution system. So as far as the rural sector is concerned, there have been an important number of steps that have been taken. And of course, all agricultural activities with respect to the Rabi crop have been allowed so that we have a great harvest in our fields so that we can go out and harvest and resume agricultural activities. So as far as the rural sector is concerned, a series of important steps have been taken there. Now, when we come to the urban sector, you'll see that there have been a number of steps that have been taken to put money into people's bank accounts through the Jan Dhan Yojana to ensure that migrant labor that is in the cities right now is provided support during the lockdown process. What has been happening, and I can vouch for this because we have done this for the people of Hazaribagh that are outside of Hazaribagh right now. We've ensured that they've got sufficient food available to them, that as soon as the lockdown was lifted, the Shramik special trains were provided to them so that they could get back home. We have created enough absorption capacity in our districts. So when these migrant populations come back to the districts, we can quarantine them effectively, look after them, test them, and then send them back home once they turn out to be corona negative. And of course, the state governments have done a wonderful job in supporting these urban populations, these migrant workers that are in the various cities. So whether it's in the rural sector or in the urban sector, the government has made sure as the first and most important priority that vulnerable sections are fully taken care of. And in that sense, both through the actions that the RBI has taken through their announcements, the actions that the Honorable Finance Minister has taken through her announcements, we have fully and comprehensively addressed the most vulnerable sections of our population. Now, we come to the additional principle. The additional principle is that we need to support our small and medium businesses and our corporate sectors. For that, of course, as you know well, and the Honorable Minister for Medium and Small and Micro Enterprises, Shri Nitin Gadkari ji, has announced the MSME package is now in its final stages. It has been thoroughly discussed with him, with obviously the Honorable Finance Minister, and then with the Honorable Prime Minister as well. And so the actions that will be taken for MSME players will be announced very shortly. And thereafter, we come to the next vulnerable group, which is the stressed sectors of the economy, whether it's aviation, tourism, travel, automotive. Here again, the government has gone through and had extensive consultations with industry representatives. The Honorable Civil Aviation Minister alluded to that yesterday in his interviews with the media, saying that he is in continuous and extensive discussions with airlines, for example. And similarly, other ministers have had thorough discussions with the different industries that they are responsible for. And whatever appropriate steps are required, the government is committed to undertaking that so that we can provide industry also with the support that is necessary. Now, please understand, the government's approach, and this is the third principle, has been an approach that has been based on vulnerability of populations and a comprehensive as well as a sequenced approach. We need to understand that everything cannot be done overnight. It has to be done in a calibrated sequence manner. So the government has addressed these in a very thoughtful and in a very sequenced manner. And so you've seen each of these different packages come out over time. So this is the third principle that the government is following right now, which is to operate in a calibrated sequenced way. And I dare say that given the very significant uncertainty that we are dealing with right now, approaching this in a calibrated, sequenced way is very, very important. And that's absolutely the way in which the government is operating. And I will come to my fourth and final principle. The final principle is that we are Team India. The government, the Honorable Prime Minister has said this many times, believes in cooperative federalism. And so all the actions that the central government has been taking has been in coordination with the various states. And this coordinated approach, this comprehensive approach, the whole of India is participating in dealing with this pandemic. And actually, when people talk about spending, there are many numbers as a percent of GDP that are thrown around. What I have found to my dismay, that in all of this, everybody is only talking about the center, when those who understand public finance know very well that actually the majority of public spending happens in the states, not necessarily in the center. And so when we look at the comprehensive total response between the center and the states relative to the pandemic, we see the kinds of announcements that are made. It becomes a very, very large and robust package to tackle all of the immediate needs that we see. And I will conclude, and then of course I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. But we also have to recognize, as I said, when we go back and we look at the medical parameters, as we look at the roadmap of this disease, that this is a disease that is going to continue to be with us for the next 18 to 24 months. We're going to have to deal with it from a policy-making perspective for the next 18 to 24 months. And therefore, when we take into account our medium-term fiscal dynamics, we want to make sure that we proceed in a sequenced and thoughtful manner, that we preserve flexibility for the future, we preserve our ability to be able to bring in even more important and more robust interventions if required in the future. If we fire all our bullets right now, we may not have bullets in the future, and you never know, as far as this pandemic is concerned, how big a second wave might be. We've seen in the case of many other countries, as well as in the Spanish flu, that there was an even bigger second wave. And if a bigger second wave comes, then we need to be prepared for that. And therefore, approaching this in a sequenced manner, in a calibrated manner, given our medium-term fiscal dynamics, is absolutely the prudent and thoughtful way to approach this. So those are the steps, those are the policy actions that the government has undertaken. Again, as I said, our four principles are: one, to address the most vulnerable sections first; second, to do it in a way that includes the MSMEs and the corporates later on, after we provided them some of the relief through the monetary package; number three, to do this in coordination with the states; and number four, to preserve some dry powder for the future. These are the principles under which the government's policy actions have unfolded. Therefore, I think not only have we done a superb job as far as managing the pandemic is concerned, keeping the total number of infections and the total number of cases in a very, very sort of controlled level. We have at the same time built up our medical facilities, our medical infrastructure very, very well. And we have also managed our economic response in a very thoughtful and in a very sequenced and prudent manner. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Jayant Sinha. You really put it so well. First of all, analyzing the different things needed to tackle corona in terms of testing, vaccine, cure. You also laid out the sequence in which the government has attacked the problem. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been speaking to multiple industrialists across various sectors. While it is undisputed that the government has tackled this crisis head on in the way we enforced a lockdown very early on. India's mortality rate, when you compare our population density to other developed countries in the world, is very low, and that's admirable. But one thing that people are questioning is, have we left it too late to announce a significant stimulus package after the first one was announced? Is it a question of timing? Because we do not know if we are at the beginning of the crisis, the middle of the crisis, or the end of the crisis. Like you said, we may not want to fire all our bullets in one go, but there is an outcry from MSMEs at this stage. So is it a question of timing, Mrs. Sinha, and how will the government really get its timing right in a pandemic like this? Because as you mentioned, it might come back to bite you, say 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line. So how's the government really going to get the timing right? And can we expect a package, say, in the next few days?
So given the very high uncertainty that we're dealing with, Chandra, you have to approach this in a sequence manner. And I think that is exactly the approach that the government has taken. Whatever the major pain points were that had to be addressed very quickly, whether it is compliance or whether it is credit availability, those pain points, those urgent pain points have been addressed by the government. Now, of course, industry has more demands. Those demands, as I said, are being carefully listened to. There's extensive consultation going on between various industries and the ministries. And as a result of that, in a prioritized way, of course, with the most vulnerable coming first, we are addressing these one by one. And so obviously we can always debate, and this is a matter of interpretation as well. What is the right timing for policy action A or policy action B? Those are all subject to debate. And the great thing about our democracy is that we have very vigorous debates about these issues. But ultimately, one has to come up with a very sequenced set of actions. And I think the government is prioritizing certain actions, and those are the ones that are being rolled out first. Obviously, everybody wants to be at the head of the line, right? In every situation, everybody wants their needs to be served first. But obviously, as a government, it stands to reason, and I think you will agree with me that the humane, compassionate thing to do is to address those populations, those people who are the most vulnerable, address them first. Make sure that the migrant labor problem is being fully and comprehensively solved, that the people who need rations are getting their rations, that the people who need to go and harvest their crops can go and harvest their crops. And then, of course, we get to MSME. So there is a very logic-driven prioritization process that is underway. Those that want to get to the head of the queue, I can understand their concern, but please bear with the government as it, in a sequence way, deals with the most vulnerable sections first.
Right. We're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A window, but just before I go to that, just one question that I wanted to ask you. The chief economic advisor in an interview a few days ago said, there's no such thing as a free lunch when asked about a big bang stimulus package. Now, some people say that, it need not be a free lunch. You can serve a lunch and charge for it, drawing parallels with what the US did with the TAR in 2008. Do you think that is something that India can explore today, to throw a fiscal lifeline that comes with some conditions? In the process, the government also can earn returns from a private sector stimulus. Do you see an approach like that happening, Mrs. Sinha, particularly for another stressed sector, which is the NBFC sector?
Chandra, I can't take economic issue with the chief economic advisor. He is the chief economic advisor. He has a PhD in finance, and I'm just, a simple politician and a business person. So I really can't, he knows much more than I do, so I will submit to his infinitely greater wisdom in these matters. All I can say is that, government should obviously, given fiscal dynamics, given fiscal priorities, find out, and this is me speaking as a politician, who are the people who are in most need and try and solve those priorities, try and solve those needs as best as they can. Whether that then results at the macroeconomic level in a free lunch or an expensive lunch or a moderately priced lunch, that experts will say. I am no expert. As I said, I'm just a simple politician. So I really cannot join issue on that matter.
Right. I'm going to take a question from the Q&A window. This is coming from Mr. Krishnan Ramachandran. He says, what can the government do for the salary tax-paying middle class? Because, they are bearing the brunt of job losses, reduced earnings because of salary cuts. What can the government do to help them? And, if you look at it, they drive the consumption engine in the country. So is there something that the government can do to put more money to drive consumption, especially among the tax-paying salaried middle class?
Yeah, Chandra, that's a very good question. And of course, whether it is the middle class, the upper middle class, the rich or the poor, anybody, the most important thing that the government can do is to control the pandemic. And as you yourself acknowledged earlier, Chandra, our government has done a fantastic job in controlling the pandemic. Because if there had been, a tremendous sort of growth in the number of cases, the economic impact on all of us and the humanitarian cost would have been unimaginable. So the most important thing that could have been done was controlling the pandemic, and we have done so. And I think the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Home Minister, and the entire cabinet and senior leadership must be congratulated and complimented on their untiring efforts to basically bring this pandemic under control. So I think that was the most important thing that's been done. Second, we have to make sure the economy is fully addressed in terms of the most vulnerable sections first, and that's exactly what the government has already done. And then the third thing I will say, which directly affects the middle class, is what is happening with interest rates. First of all, for the middle class, which typically are making EMI payments and so on, home mortgage payments, they've given a 3-month moratorium so that they get relief in terms of their EMIs and their payments and so on. And of course, interest rates have been cut. And as interest rates have been cut, obviously EMIs have come down as well. So the middle class has benefited directly from all of these by the control of the pandemic, by making sure that the most vulnerable sections of the population, the economy, are dealt with, and that interest rates and EMI payments are given a moratorium. So those three things, which were the most urgent, have been addressed. Now, of course, the government is addressing the next set of issues, which are issues around economic growth, around job losses, and so on. And that is how I'm sure the pipeline of policy actions will develop going forward.
Right. Another question coming in from the Q&A window. This is coming from Nagapan. He has two questions. And the second question is, how well placed is India to take advantage of a situation wherein China is isolated currently globally and many companies are looking to move out of China? So, in a sense, could this be India's Make in India moment? What kind of policy actions do we need to really enable that?
That's a great question, Chandra, and I have already written extensively on this topic. This is a golden opportunity to build the new India of our dreams. Golden opportunity. Why is that? Number one, because India's relative position globally has gone up dramatically. Certain other countries are not as much in favor as they were earlier. India has dealt with the pandemic and demonstrated extraordinary leadership and state capacity, which has raised India's stock globally. So India relatively has gone up, number one. Number two, important inputs for India have come down. Oil prices have come down, interest rates have come down, commodity prices in general have come down. So a number of inputs that are required for building India are much cheaper than they have before. Number three, fiscal deficit, which was a major constraint for us and for everyone in the world, is less of an issue now. It's still an issue, of course, because we don't have the world's reserve currency, that is the dollar. We have the rupee. But fiscal deficits are not quite as important now as they used to be. And as a result, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of spending. So that's a third thing in our favor. And the fourth thing in our favor is that the credibility of the Honorable Prime Minister, his ability to lead from the front and to really inspire us to take the next few bold steps in terms of economic growth are unparalleled right now. We've had exemplary, very stable, very inspirational leadership from the Honorable Prime Minister and his entire team. And as a result of that, we can now undertake really extraordinary policy actions, extraordinary steps towards building this country. And so this is a fantastic opportunity, not just for Make in India, but also to build the new India of our dreams. And, as they say, there is a saying which says, if you get lemons, make lemonade. So sadly, of course, we've had to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, and there has been a terrible, terrible loss of life. And we've carried a very severe burden of disease around the world. But for India, relatively speaking, there is some great lemonade to be made. Nibu ka pani bahut badhiya mithas usme ek aa rahi hai, mujhe lagta hai. Because we can now really go ahead and we can really enable India to grow in a way that we could not have imagined.
Chandra,
Right.
quickly, sorry to interrupt you, quickly, can we take some questions from the audience? We are very happy to have with us Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran. Let me just invite him to share his thoughts.
Thank you, Vanita, and also thank you, Mr. Sinha, for this wonderful exposition of the situation and how the government has prioritized and the framework it has used in responding to the economic and other threats posed by the.
So, Anant, are you here?
I think we lost him.
I think we lost him. In the
No, I think I have been sort of labeled
yes.
analyst now. So.
Okay. Go ahead, Anand. We can hear you now.
So I was going to move away from the COVID-related question to a different question. You are a chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Financial Sector, if I'm not mistaken. So in general, in many other countries with parliamentary democracies, these committees have a full-time research staff, etc. So in terms of some of the concerns that have been expressed recently about the orders and circulars getting revised and re-revised, etc., would it make sense for the government to invest in permanent research support for the various parliamentary standing committees, because that is the committee which actually examines the bills and then finalizes the bills before sending it back to the parliament? So will the quality of governance, the quality of legislation, etc., improve significantly if there's an investment made in a permanent research support for all the various standing committees? It will also help our youngsters to become more acquainted with the process of governance and lawmaking, etc. Would you consider that as an important step forward as we think about various reforms post COVID virus?
Thank you very much for asking that question, because I completely agree with you. Yes, indeed, we need to strengthen research capabilities in Parliament. And of course, at the Standing Committee on Finance in Parliament, we take up very, very important issues. We've gone through and looked at the amendments to the IPC code, for example, and we've looked at that in detail. And we get very, very good inputs in the depositions that we have, the hearings that we have. Those are very, very thoughtful and detailed in many cases, but it is still very important for the committee to develop an independent perspective on many of these submissions that we get. We certainly do have some excellent researchers from Parliament that help us out, but particularly for the Standing Committee on Finance, because the technical nature of many of the subjects that we look at, it would be great to have a permanent research staff that will assist us in examining some of these legislations and some of these issues that come before Parliament. So I'm in complete agreement with your suggestion. The way we manage, of course, is to do it somewhat informally, is by asking people to advise us and recommend to us how best to address some of the issues that come before us. But I do believe the time has come to have permanent research staff in Parliament to examine these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anant. Let me now invite Mr. N. Ravi of The Hindu. He has a question too.
This is on migrant labor that are needed critically to restart industries. Yet, rather than persuading them to stay or incentivizing them to stay, is it right to force them to stay put against their will by cancelling trains or waiting for states to agree and so on? And by the way, Mr. Sinha, thank you for an excellent opening presentation that placed the issues in a medium-term perspective.
Good evening, Mr. Ravi, and you have asked a very important question about migrant labor. I myself have taken many initiatives in this regard. Not only have I provided support to many people from Hazaribagh that are in cities around the country, I also asked them to fill up a form through my social media handles so that we could get a sense of where they are and how many they are. And so just from the Hazaribagh, which of course, as you know, is in Jharkhand, sample, I can tell you that within a day and a half of putting up this online form, I got about 50,000 people. And these filings are continuing even after that. So 50,000 people, of which 18,000 are in Mumbai, have said that they are right now away from their homes and they want to migrate back to their homes in Hazaribagh and Ramgarh, my two districts. Of course, I have provided this list to the MHA control room. Sadly, I must say that despite my best efforts, I have not been able to get the Jharkhand government, which of course, as you know, is ruled by the JMM right now, to really proactively engage with this migrant labor. But we are making our best efforts to ensure that these people get back home safely and as quickly as possible. And of course, in our constitutional democracy, there is freedom of movement. I don't need to say anything more than to say that people in our country, wherever they may be, whether they are in Chennai, whether they are in Etawah in UP, whether they are in Itanagar in Arunachal Pradesh, wherever they may be, they have the constitutional right to move, constitutional right to go wherever they want.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ravi. Let's move on to the next participant, Mr. Hemachandran Logan. He has a question. Go ahead, Hem.
Yeah, this is Hemachandran. A very good evening, sir. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My question is on behalf of the consumers. My question is, post-lockdown, consumers' behaviors will change, like especially the purchase attitude, and number of consumers are becoming life simplifiers, and a lot of degrowth activism is happening now. Basically, hygiene phobia. And when people come out, I don't know whether they'll go for shopping or whether the economy will come back with the purchasing power of consumers. So how the government or the stakeholders or the entrepreneurs have to come together to bring a positive socializing scenario. So bringing back the positive scenario in the country. This government is trying to take any a campaign model or any awareness model post-lockdown.
Well, Mr. Hemchandran, we are not yet at the stage where we are done with the pandemic. And of course, we will need to have a laser focused containment going forward. So we still have to battle the coronavirus even at this stage. Of course, when it comes to consumer behavior, we have to let the marketing experts tell us what's the right way to motivate consumer behavior right now. Certainly what they have found in China after removing the lockdown is that there is quote unquote what people are calling revenge shopping that is happening because of the pent-up demand. People are coming out, they are spending money. So we might see some of that in India. And of course, you know, because I have full faith and confidence in our business people, in our entrepreneurs, they will surely come up with excellent and very, very attractive ways of inducing people to come into shops and to start to purchase goods and services again. So I have full faith and confidence in our business community that as soon as we reach the situation where we can resume largely a normal life, that they will make it very, very attractive for consumers to participate again in the consumer economy. Okay,
so thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hem. I think Mr. Singaraja is unmuted. Could we go back to him? Are you there, Mr. Singaraja? Okay, let me pass it on to Anand in the meanwhile, Anand Raghavan.
Hello, this is Narasimhalu. Jayant, thank you very much. Thank you very much. My question is, hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
Can I?
Yeah, you're audible, sir.
Yeah. This is. Are we started late in starting the social distancing measure? Because that time, February should have been the right time, and that time we allowed many foreign travelers to land in, and this is where the pandemic has spreaded much. And after that only we did. And second question is, the train arrangement should have been done for the migrant much before, in April first week itself. Now we are doing again, they have to be quarantined or self-isolation for next 15 days. This is another losing their time of yearning. No? Thank you.
Mr. Gangapan, I'm not an epidemiologist and I don't run epidemiological models. So it's very difficult for me to say whether it was early. Perhaps you've been looking at these models and you have a perspective on that. All I can do is compare India's experience with those of other large countries. And if you look at how we have been able to manage the number of cases, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we have done a superb job in keeping growth rates low and containing the pandemic. So what the epidemiologists will say 25 years from now, whether it was earlier, all I can say is compared to other countries, we've done a superb job. Now, with respect to the train, again, here is recognized that there has to be an capacity in the various districts where the migrant labor will return. I just gave you the example of my own districts of Hazaribagh, where across Hazaribagh and Ramgarh, when we have asked how many people want to come back, 50,000 people have said they want to come back. Now, when you have these many large numbers, it's not possible to allow people to go from cities to the rural areas and be able to manage the lockdown well. So we have a real challenge in handling the migration from the point of view of the lockdown and the pandemic growth. So I think given all of these constraints, given all of these considerations, the very fact that the number of coronavirus cases is as low as it has been because of the preemptive steps that we have taken tells us that we are doing extraordinarily well relative to other countries, and we should all be very proud of what we have all accomplished. This is not, of course, just the government, it's the state governments as well, and the citizens of our brave country that have gone through and handled these lockdowns, handled these restrictions extraordinarily well with tremendous fortitude.
Anand, please go ahead. We can hear you.
Yeah. Mr. Sinha, we are told that some of the banks who are flush with funds are extremely risk averse and they do not want to lend on the basis that their NPAs will go up and there will be a capital adequacy problem in the medium term. What do you think should be the confidence boosting message from the government to make banks lend, if not indiscriminately, at least aggressive?
These are very difficult questions for us outside in to develop a perspective on. By and large, the credit market is actually working quite well. And this is because of the excellent steps taken by the Reserve Bank of India. If the credit market was not working well, then we would be in a situation where the market clearing price would be spiking, which it is not right now. So the market clearing prices are quite stable, markets are clearing smoothly, and credit markets overall are functioning quite well. The issue, I don't think so much is whether the markets are working well or not. The issue is whether the credit demand is there. And it's quite evident that in a situation where we have shut down economic activity through the lockdown, that credit demand will come down. When credit demand comes down, the demand curve shifts to the left. Obviously, there will be less need to supply credit. So I think that's really what we are seeing right now. I think once the lockdown starts to be lifted and we go to the very precise containment model that we are moving towards in lockdown phase 3.0, credit demand will naturally start to rise as firms' activities start to increase. So I think that's a very natural reaction. What we need to look at is what are the market clearing prices to figure out whether markets are working well or not. And to that, when we look at the prices are telling us that the credit markets are working well. What we have to obviously now weigh in the bargain, and what we have to watch out for is what happens to credit demand going forward. And that's, I think, going to be a function of how the lockdowns play out.
Thanks, Anand. And the next question from Mr. Vaidya Subramanian.
Thank you, Mr. Jayant. The question that I have is, you spoke about the distressed migrant laborers issue. Of course, freedom of movement is a constitutional right, and once this all is eased out, is there a plan to have a rehabilitation package? Because as much as they are integral to the economic recovery process, how will we incentivize their re-entry into the economic mainstream? And secondly, what will be the economic impact if India enters into the United Nations Security Council, which Mr. Akbaruddin said that by all calculi, India has a very bright chance?
I don't really know whether it's possible to come up with what the economic impact of India becoming a non-permanent member of the Security Council would be. So I'm not going to hazard a guess on that particular issue. But coming back to your first question regarding how do we bring folks back from their homes in rural areas and have them once again get productive in our cities, I think what we are seeing from various states is a lot of creative experimentation and a lot of innovation on that. You have seen in the state of Karnataka the kinds of packages, the kinds of incentives that are being made available to people who potentially are already back in their villages or might be wanting to come back from the villages, and also to enable people who are there to stay there. So we will see a lot of innovation and creativity from our state governments to ensure that migrant labor stays where they are. And certainly, if there's anything that's required from the central government in that regard, I'm sure the central government will provide necessary support.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vaidya. Chandra, over to you to take the questions, take more questions from the participants. Thanks.
One of which is, should the government be bailing out the mutual fund industry? A lot of questions being asked on the recent issue with respect to Franklin. And the second one, a lot of people are asking is, how are you going to achieve that delicate balance between giving a package and not breaching fiscal norms, because that could lead to a downgrading of our sovereign rating. So how are we going to achieve that balance? Will we look at this as a percentage of GDP? Do we have room to perhaps expand from the current 0.7, 0.8% of GDP, that's the size of our stimulus, to 1.52%? How is the government looking at this?
So Chandra, let me address your first question, which is about mutual funds. There, as you know, the Reserve Bank of India has already made 50,000 crores available to banks to be able to onward lend to mutual funds, so that if mutual funds are facing redemption pressure, they can borrow from the banks and then be able to enable redemption to happen. I think, personally speaking, that if you're running a credit fund, particularly ultra short credit funds, then you have to make redemption available to your investors, because that was the fundamental premise of investing in an ultra short fund, because the duration of those funds is only 3 to 6 months. And the idea there is you have liquidity available when you need it. Now, if certain fund managers have not managed their duration well, or they've not managed their book well, and they get into a situation where the paper that they have cannot be redeemed without having big price impact, then those are very serious considerations in terms of how they are managing short-term, short-duration funds. And I'm sure the regulators are looking at that and trying to make sure that fund managers are running these funds as per the mandate that they have received, and they're not chasing yields while doing something that would be amiss in terms of regulation and prudential and risk control measures are concerned. So I would expect mutual funds to put in place appropriate risks and manage their books, taking into account appropriate risk and control measures. So that is the expectation, that is the fiduciary responsibility that all funds have. And so one would expect those funds to operate under those circumstances. As you know, that in the Standing Committee on Finance, we do have oversight over the operations of mutual funds and the operations of various regulators. So I'm sure mutual funds will take that into account in terms of how they operate their mutual funds, how they operate their books. Now, coming to your second question, Chandra, in terms of the medium-term fiscal dynamics, clearly those are areas that require significant analysis. We have to worry not just about fiscal 21, we have to worry about fiscal 22 and 23. And Chandra, what I would like to remind you about is what happened right after the global financial crisis, when the fiscal deficit went from 2.5% of GDP to 6% of GDP and then 6.5% of GDP. And the consequences, the medium-term consequences of that massive increase in fiscal deficit were actually very damaging for our economy, because what that meant was that growth slumped. We had growth coming down to 4%, 4.5%. We had inflation going up to 9 or 10%. We had a current account mini crisis, a mini balance of payments crisis. There was the taper tantrum that then ended up resulting in the rupee going from 42, 43 to 68. So you take risks with your fiscal dynamics at your peril. And given what we have seen previously in the global financial crisis, I think it's very important to be thoughtful about the medium-term fiscal dynamics and think through carefully what is required, which is why I said initially that the principle the government is following is to be thoughtful, be prudent, take into account not just the short-term fiscal situation, but the medium-term fiscal dynamics as well. India's debt to GDP is close to 70%, which is also something that we need to take into account.
Right. Mr. Sinha, when the Make in India question came up in the Q&A window, you spoke about how, this will usher in a new India. People are, talking about how we shouldn't waste a crisis, that, we must use the crisis to usher in more reforms. We saw some of that happening yesterday with, some states announcing changes to their labor laws. Has the time come then for widespread labor reforms? Will we see an ordinance coming from the government as far as this is concerned? Because this has been talked about for a while now, that, when are labor reforms coming? Would this be a right time for that? Because we are getting signals from states, not just BJP ruled states, even, Rajasthan has changed some norms there. Is this going to be the next big reform to expect?
Chandra, I'll remind you that in Madhya Pradesh, not only have they reformed labor laws, they have massively opened up agricultural markets as well. And so now any farmer can sell to any buyer. You don't have to necessarily go through the mandi. And this is, I think, a terrific example of how our federal system works and what cooperative federalism is all about. When it came to labor reform, what developed in our first term was very significant experimentation, very significant innovation at the state level. And many states did an excellent job of making it possible for new factories, new investments to be made in their various states, and they benefited from that. Let me give you the example of Jharkhand when it was ruled by the BJP government. We created a very progressive and very encouraging set of labor policies, particularly on the textile side. And as a result of that, many textile firms opened up large factories in Jharkhand because of the support that they were getting from the government as far as labor policies were concerned. And this has led to thousands and thousands of jobs in labor-intensive textile manufacturing in Jharkhand. And in fact, some of the factories are right at the border of Hazaribagh, so I see it all the time as to the kind of impact that this kind of innovation in labor policies has had. So the wonderful aspect of our federal system is that labor is on the concurrent list, and therefore different states can compete with each other, different states can innovate, different states can experiment, and this then creates a race to the top in terms of progressive policies, whether it's in labor, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in healthcare, all of the subjects that are in the concurrent list or the state list.
Right. A couple of questions from the Q&A window, Mr. Sinha. One question asking you, why the government is not passing on the benefits of falling crude prices to consumers in these stressful times when, your pockets are already being pinched because of salary cuts and other such issues. And the other coming from the startup ecosystem with respect to the change in regulations for investments from China. What kind of an impact is that going to have? Because domestic funding for startups, at least what I've seen, it's very minimal. It's being driven by foreign funding, be it the SoftBanks of the world, be it China, be it US. So what impact is this going to have on the startup ecosystem?
So Chandra, coming to your first question, which was about fuel prices and excise prices, or excise that is now being applied to fuel prices, there are two very good reasons for what the government has done, and I applaud the excellent step that they have taken as far as excise is concerned for fuel. The one aspect of this is that it increases government revenues, and at this stage we do need all the revenues that we can get because we have significant spending that's required for the coronavirus pandemic. So I think that's a very good thing that the government has done to increase its revenues, and not just the central government, but many states. For example, Delhi have also increased VAT so that they can increase their revenues as well. So that's one very good reason for doing it. The other very good reason for doing it is that right after the coronavirus crisis that we're dealing with right now, we are going to have to deal with the climate change crisis. And by keeping excise high on fossil fuels, we are ensuring that we continue to substitute away from fossil fuels. We keep moving towards renewable sources of energy, to electric transportation, electric mobility, which also is going to be very, very important for our future. So for both those reasons, first, because of revenue, and second, because we really want to ensure that there is a high carbon tax that we are applying, I think increasing excise on fuel is a very, very good idea. Now, Chandra, coming to your second question about startup funding, I see that we have Gopal Srinivasan here with us, and Gopal and his colleagues in the Indian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association are very, very capable right now of funding our startups. I know that they have more than $20 billion of dry powder available in the private equity venture capital industry. And therefore, all our startups that are doing well, that require funding, are going to be, I'm sure, fully supported by Gopal and his colleagues. And of course, as I said, India's relative position globally has gone up dramatically post the coronavirus pandemic. And so I'm sure lots of capital will be coming to India. Of course, the cost of capital also has gone down. So that's very good news for our startups and our entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Mr. Sinha. I see more questions coming from the audience. Let me invite Mr. Mani Iyer to ask his question.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, we can hear you, sir. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. I think you are very instrumental in bringing fund of funds through SIDBI. Under India Aspiration Fund, I was there at that time, and later through Fund of Fund for Startups in a very professional manner. You brought the Venture Capital Investment Committee, etc. Why can't we think of some funds on the lines of NIF with overseas participation for putting money or equity in the MSMEs directly, as they cannot borrow at this juncture? No banks will afford to lend them because the delinquency is very high. It is time that such options are thought of, and you are the right person to initiate such ideas.
Mr. Iyer, you are actually contradicting yourself. If you're saying delinquencies are very high, why would anyone take that credit risk, or even that equity risk for that matter? I think the more important thing is we need to make sure, as we have been doing, that there is tremendous ease of doing business, that our policies as far as industries are concerned are very supportive of business. The Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Finance Minister have said over and over again that we support wealth creators, we support job creators. We want our MSME sector to do really well, to be able to employ more people, and whatever policies are required to make them more successful, to enable them to generate more revenues, more cash flow, we should really focus on that. If we focus on those, then they will be very, very good investments to make. Whether you look at it on the equity side or whether you look at it from the debt side, credit demand will go up if we support them, and they will be able to find the capital that they require. So I think the more important question we need to ask, and in fact it is the right question to ask, which is, can our MSMEs be successful in the markets that they compete in? Are they competitive? Can they generate good substantial profits? If we answer those basic questions, then both credit and equity will find its way to the MSME sector. By asking either our banks or our equity investors to subsidize bad credit risk or bad businesses, I don't think we can grow our economy on that basis. That would be at least my.
We have one more question from Mr. Srinivasan Vishwanathan.
Yes, please. Am I audible now?
You are audible.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
There is a very serious issue of adjusting to the post-lockdown period. Already we have examples of private hospitals making exorbitant charges without any control. Some news reports point to as high as rupees 70,000 per day, and making charges on all and sundry items. Look at the possibility of we were lifting lockdown, and with supply chains totally disrupted, you have the risk of many products priced upwards without any rhyme or reason. And it will be very difficult to control these because these are all done differently in different places. Look also at the possibility of opening up air service. You have handled civil aviation, Mr. Sinha. how would you prevent airlines from making huge charges? It's not uncommon for them to charge 30,000 at times of demand. How will you protect these things?
So, Mr. Vishwanathan, you're absolutely right. Once we get into the lockdown 3.0 stage, we have to very tightly contain the areas where there are outbreaks. But then we have to let the rest of the economy get back to well-functioning markets. And once we have well-functioning markets where we have stable and good competition happening, then the market clearing prices are set at good levels, reasonable levels, which reflect the underlying costs. And that,
sir, that will be some months away, sir. That will be some weeks and months away. My concern is what will happen for the immediate 1 or 2 months in which there can be predatory pricing and total exploitation. How will you address it?
Mr. Vishwanathan, whenever there is predatory pricing, you have the opportunity to intervene through the legal system and through the Competition Commission of India. So if you believe that there is a case for predatory pricing, you can certainly take it up with the competent authorities. But again, as I said, the most important thing is we have to tightly contain the outbreaks. We have to let markets operate well. And markets, when they operate well, they clear efficiently. And so prices are set at the right levels. So the most important thing I would beseech all local administrators, as I have with my own DCs in Hazaribagh and Ramgarh, which is let markets operate well, let there be sufficient competition, and if there's sufficient competition and sufficient availability in terms of supply, markets will clear at good prices. And if they are not clearing at good prices, if there is predatory pricing because of monopolistic behavior or people are controlling supply, then there are legal remedies for that. And I would urge everyone to approach the courts or approach competent authorities to seek those legal remedies.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. Let's just take one more question from Ms. Sunita Reddy. She's also a trustee of CIC. Yeah, go ahead.
Jayant, I really would like to congratulate you on the lockdown. After wielding a very heavy hammer, when we removed the lockdown, we're in day 52 of the lockdown. As we remove the lockdown, we are sort of bracing for impact because we really do not have sufficient testing, nor do we have the medicines that will deal with what we believe is a huge epidemic. Therefore, I would like to know what the government can do to support the healthcare sector. People have alluded to the high cost of the healthcare sector without recognizing that currently we are importing all medication. We are using PPE kits which are very expensive, and the cost of infrastructure and the fact that we're keeping our workforce intact. So please tell us what you can do for the healthcare sector and what you can do to retool India so that we can capture the opportunity which lies ahead of us.
Sunita ji, as you know, the Honorable Prime Minister has already announced 15,000 crores from the central government to strengthen and build up India's medical facilities. So that money is there. There is obviously more money available to be spent on our medical facilities. And of course, each government also is spending extensively on the medical side. In addition, what this is demonstrating is that there is very significant demand, not just for coronavirus treatments, but for many other treatments as well. And when you see that kind of demand growth, then investors such as Gopal and others will of course rush in to provide you with the necessary debt and the necessary equity so that you can expand your facilities. And we will see, I think, very significant investments on all aspects of the medical value chain. I'm very sure that that will happen because there is now significantly higher demand for medical services. So both in terms of government spending on public healthcare, center plus state, as well as in terms of private sector investment, we will see a massive build out of our medical facilities. And equally, as we see the hard infrastructure coming in, I think it's very important that the government also build up the soft infrastructure. And there, I will submit that the government has taken two very bold and far-reaching steps even prior to the coronavirus pandemic, which now appear in retrospect to have been prescient in terms of the impact that they're having. And I refer it, of course, to the fact that we have thoroughly reformed medical education by going to the National Medical Commission, and have also announced that we will set up medical colleges in each district. And again, I will come back to Hazaribagh and say in Hazaribagh, we within 3 or 4 years were able to establish and set up a medical college. We now have 120 students in our medical college, which is government run in Hazaribagh alone, and this is happening across all the districts of Jharkhand also. So in this manner, the government is dramatically increasing the hard infrastructure as well as dramatically improving the soft infrastructure as well. These are going to be all required in the future. And of course, we all have to provide all the necessary support to all of you in the medical sector as well.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. I think we are crossing our time. Chandra, should we just take one last question?
Yeah, just one last question, Mr. Sinha, before we wrap up. This is, on news that's just come in. The government has estimated that, its borrowing for the current financial year is going to be 12 lakh crore rupees in place of 7.80 lakh rupees. So, and they've said the above revision in borrowings have been necessary on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this will mean our fiscal target will overshoot. So, where will the resources come from? Will the markets have enough money to buy government bonds? If, you can just weigh in on this.
Chandra, this news has clearly just come in, as you yourself have said, so I'll have to study it to give a thoughtful response to this. But clearly, if you look at the government's borrowing requirements, those are going to be driven by two factors. One, because there will in fact most likely be a revenue shortfall because obviously economic activity has come down relative to the budget estimates, and because we have to spend more to support the economy and to support vulnerable populations. So because of both factors, government's borrowing requirements are going to go up, and that in fact seems to have been announced just now. Now, how this is best going to be absorbed in the market, I think we'll have to wait for the government and experts in the market to give us their views. I'll also have to study it. So let me look at that, and then perhaps we'll have another chance to discuss this.
Right. On that note, Mrs. Sinha, thank you so much for joining us with your insights, for expounding on the problem from various dimensions in your introduction, and also patiently taking questions over the last 1 hour on various aspects of this pandemic. It was very insightful, and thank you very much for giving us your time and perspective. We hope you continue to take care and stay safe in New Delhi, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayant, again for your insightful and composed remarks. Really appreciate it. It's given a lot of confidence to us.
Yeah. Thank you, Sinha, for the clarity and honesty with which you have summed up the challenge posed by the pandemic and the government's response to it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We will meet again next Friday. We'll keep you posted on the upcoming programs. Thank you once again, and have a good evening.